I want to emphasize that this podcast is not meant to convince anyone of the correctness of any political system. I do not endorse communism or capitalism or any other political system. However, I endorse peaceful coexistence between human beings whenever that is possible or realistic. America has a long history of anti communism, going all the way back to the year 1919 and continuing up until the present day. However, the height of anti communist attitudes in America could be identified as occurring during the Cold War. Listen to this speech by Ronald Reagan, which took place on the 8th of March, 1983.
A number of years ago, I heard a young father, a very prominent young man in the entertainment world, addressing a tremendous gathering in California. It was during the time of the Cold War, and communism and our own way of life were very much on people's minds, and he was speaking to that subject. And suddenly, though, I heard him saying, "I love my little girls more than anything," and I said to myself, "Oh no, don't say that." But I had underestimated him. He went on, "I would rather see my little girls die now, still believing in God, than have them grow up under communism and one day die no longer believing in God."
Relations between Christians and communists have been historically bad across the globe. So, is it even possible for these two systems, communism and Christianity, to exist peacefully together? I spoke with one of my professors, Isaac Hecht, about the historical relationship between communism and Christianity. The reason why I decided to interview him was because in our class, we spend a lot of time reading left wing literature, specifically literature that's influenced by Marxism and communist ideology. So I thought that he might have some particular insight into the historical relationship between the two different ideologies. Welcome to Red Alert. So the topic for today is God and communism. Before we start getting into those topics, could you quickly define those terms? So in your estimation, who or what is God?
I say God has three registers. There's what I would call the base level or foundational level, where we have basically just chaos. I'll say the second moment of God is a collapse of this chaos into some sort of stable reality, and then the process and the phenomena of the stable reality form the third register of God.
Could you define communism?
Yeah. I'll start by defining what I think it's not. So a lot of people talk about communism today. They usually mean an extension of left-wing ideologies and values to the point where we're not just talking about equality of political rights or equality of opportunity, but we're talking about an economic equality, guaranteed standard of living, redistributed wealth, equal commodities, equal products for everyone, regardless of race, gender, birthplace, religion, and all that. And to be clear, I think all those things are fine. I don't see necessarily a big problem with wanting to redistribute wealth and all that, but I think the problem with that view of communism is that it still makes material wealth the ultimate arbiter of what makes life worth living, what makes a person happy or free or have a worthwhile life. And so I think it's more important to define communism in a philosophical way, which takes account of what is it that actually makes life worth living, and what is it that distinguishes human life from animal life, from plant life? What is it that is distinct about the human experience that cannot be directly reduced to material power or material wealth? And so I think talking about communism in relation to God is very necessary, because we have to define communism as certainly some sort of equality, and some sort of not just abstract idealistic equality, but an equality that actually has real effects in human society. But it has to be something other than just material wealth. We have to talk about desire, about subjectivity, about these mental, philosophical, spiritual aspects of human existence that have no one-to-one correspondence with how much material wealth or material capacity you have.
So you would say that communism goes beyond economic and political policies?
Absolutely. I mean, maybe one way to narrow it down a little bit would be to say that communism is a political and economic way of trying to translate these spiritual realities into a practical program for society. But I do not think that raising the standard of living is the goal of human life.
What are your thoughts on communism in relation to Christianity?
I think it has generally been a bad relationship, historically speaking. The reason that a lot of communist movements and communist states have failed, not just politically, economically failed, but also philosophically and spiritually failed, is that because of the exigencies of practical politics, they have tried to make communism just about material production, equal distribution, material comfort, material wealth. And they have generally shied away from thinking about these more abstract metaphysical questions. And so, like, until 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, I think that Christianity, like the Christian West, was still basically the most progressive, most rational form of society. But in 1917, it's like things sort of split. And on the one hand, I think the communist countries are much more rational economically, thinking about how to organize production and social relations in a rational way, which the West is not doing. But I think philosophically, the communist countries, and spiritually and culturally, they are often very backwards. And I think the Christian West is still much more rational and liberatory when it comes to philosophy.
As my professor noted, relations between Christians and communists have been bad for a long time, and America has historically been a Christian country. Like Reagan expressed at the beginning of this podcast, this fact has been used as a cudgel to instill fear into the American people. The idea that communism is a demonic ideology, that it would send people straight to hell, was pervasive in the 20th century. But America has also been becoming less and less religious, especially the younger generation. So if Americans are becoming less and less religious, would it follow that more young people would potentially be open to communism?
Do you think that the younger generation of Americans is more sympathetic to communist ideology?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's hard to tell. It's hard to get real data on this, because so much of politics is online now for younger generations. But from what I've seen, I mean, I think Gen Z men voted for Trump by like plus 20. I don't know about women. When I was growing up, I'm a millennial. There was this sense that young people are always radical. And that doesn't really seem to be true, especially because my generation, millennials, who are now basically middle aged, are still pretty left wing and socialist, whereas the younger generations don't seem to be as much.
What my professor told me was fascinating, so I wanted to check in with some of the other students in our class to see if what he told me aligned with the thoughts and opinions of the students.
The first student that I interviewed was Colin Johnson, who's a student at the University of Utah studying secondary education.
So we met in an English course, incidentally, and I recently interviewed our professor this Sunday. The topic of our conversation was God and communism. Incidentally, we also end up talking about communism quite a bit in our course, or colonialism, anti imperialism. I first want to know, what do you think communism is?
To me, communism is a political structure in which things are done by the masses for the masses. So, on paper, to me, that would mean nobody's really in necessarily a position of leadership. There's kind of equality among people. I think in practice, it has never really worked out that way. You always end up with more people who are in power, and then by extension, they end up having more. So that's kind of what I would define it as.
So you would say that communism usually fails to live up to the goals that it sets for itself?
I think so. I think most political systems do, but I think communism is one that we've seen more of, like failing in history than other systems.
So something that was particularly fascinating to me when I was interviewing our professor on Sunday, he said that, and I'm not directly quoting him, but he said something to the effect that he notices that in his students, actually, his students are becoming less left leaning and moving more towards the right. And our professor, he identified himself as a millennial. So he basically said that like his generation is actually more liberalized and progressive in his estimation than the younger generation. So I just want to know, do you agree with that assessment?
I do think we're kind of seeing a swing farther to the right. I'd be curious to know how much of it is like really skewed from people of our generation, my generation, who are going really far right. I mean, I would consider myself definitely more left leaning. I'm sure there are people out there who are more left leaning than I am. I think in a way with millennials there was almost like a pendulum swing where they went way far to one side as a reactionary to the boomers. And I think that Gen Z, which is my generation, is kind of swinging back. I don't think we're going to get a full swing back into like really deep conservatism with future generations, but I do think that we've kind of found maybe a bit more of a middle ground.
Do you think that younger generations of Americans, like let's say around your age, are sympathetic to communism?
I think in some ways, yes. My personal kind of take on that is that it's less of a like sympathy towards communism and more of a reactionary against a failing democracy that we're seeing in the US. I think it's more of like a desire for change more than anything else. And I think that on paper, communism does seem ideal to a lot of people. You know, I think when people look at it, they kind of view it as like, well, if everybody's getting equal everything, then everybody's kind of thriving. And historically, we've just seen that that's not true. It means that everybody tends to get less. You know, there's less food going around. And my aunt was Venezuelan, her family's Venezuelan, and they lived under a communist regime and they were pretty staunchly anti-communist because of that. They understood how it can seem really appealing, but they also had to wait in bread lines and they had to wait in line to get toilet paper and all these things. And so that's definitely something that I think a lot of people my age don't have that experience of that I do. That kind of gives me a different viewpoint on it.
So in the past, American politicians have described communism as being a threat to American society, and that was the justification even for invading countries like Vietnam. So, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that? Like, do you believe, for example, that communism is a threat to America or American society?
I think communism is a threat to politicians' powers. I think 9 out of 10 times that you're seeing American politicians say that XYZ is a threat to the American way of life, it's a threat to them.
According to at least one of his students, the youth are becoming more sympathetic to communism as a result of the disappointment that they feel with the current political system. However, I feel obliged to point out to our listeners that communism and democracy are not mutually exclusive systems, and as a matter of fact, both China and Vietnam, which are currently communist countries, practice democracy. So turning to communism as a result of disappointment with democracy, simply speaking, doesn't really make sense. I also spoke with Connor Crambuel, an engineering student who is in the same class with us.
So I spoke with our professor on Sunday, and something that he said, which I found particularly interesting. So first off, our professor identified himself as a millennial, and he said that his students were not becoming more radicalized to the left, but that they're actually becoming more right wing. Do you agree with that sentiment?
I would, yeah.
So what do you think is causing that?
It's a complex question, and I don't think that I have all the answers. But from what I'm seeing, a lot of it is the internet. A lot of it is where people go on the internet, and then how those algorithms steer people towards certain ideas that make certain people money.
So the reason why I bring this up is because the topic for our conversation on Sunday was God and communism. And it's interesting that you bring up the internet because it is true that the internet and algorithms in general do radicalize people. But why do you think it's radicalizing? Or I don't even want to say radicalizing, but why do you think it's influencing people to become more right wing instead of, say, more communistic?
I think because it is actually closing off people's want to get new ideas. I think that a lot of people are growing up in an environment where they just want to be told something. And I think that the right is much better at validating people's emotions rather than saying, oh, you're wrong, you're this, you're that. I think that the left doesn't validate as often. And so I think for like men, they're going to find a lot more validation going towards the right instead of going towards the left.
Would you say that communism is a threat to American society?
I think it's a threat to some people within American society.
What people would it be a threat to?
I would say probably the top 2%.
Incredibly, both students agreed, independently of each other, that communism is not a threat to American society at large. Indeed, while it's true that America has invaded several communist countries, no communist country has ever invaded America. From these interviews that I had with students, I got the impression that while the young generation may seem a bit softer on communism, they didn't seem especially sympathetic towards it. But it's still a far cry from the rampant anti-communism that would have characterized the 20th century during the McCarthy era. But the opinions of two separate students can hardly categorize an entire generation. Nonetheless, their responses were very intriguing. It doesn't seem obvious that there's any kind of a socialist revolution brewing among the youth. But conversely, the attitude towards communism, at least amongst the students that I spoke to, is decidedly not one of outright aggression. In an age of open capitalist imperialism, such as the war in Iran or the Israel-Gaza war, the peaceful nature of communist countries, by comparison, may serve to radicalize the youth and make them less optimistic about the current state of society, and also soften their opinions towards communism. Going back to the interview with my professor, we continue to speak about communism, its origins, its current state, and its potential future.
So the next question will be a little more complicated. I'm going to list 5 people that are associated with communism or Marxism. So Ho Chi Minh, Stalin, Che Guevara, Karl Marx, and Fidel Castro. Could you rank them 1 to 5 in terms of how nice you think their facial hair is?
Karl Marx definitely the best.
Karl Marx number 1.
Yeah. I say Stalin's number 2. Fidel number 3. Wow! Che number 4. Wow! Ho Chi Minh number 5. Wow! Maybe that's racist. I don't like the long thin.
The more Oriental style.
Yeah.
To take a slight detour, would you describe God as a communist?
No. Well, I'm not sure exactly what that would mean. Because, and I guess I didn't get this far when I was answering the question earlier. To me, communism would be a political program that says every person in their mental activity is participating in this process of God that we define that like every person by having a mind and thinking is participating in these three moments of God. And so like that is the highest goal of human life. And communism would just be saying everyone simply by possession of a rational mind has the same relationship to that process of God, regardless of like whether you're fat or thin or ugly or beautiful or rich or poor or black or white, man or woman. Just the fact of having a rational mind is what connects you to that process of God, which is the highest goal of human life.
Would you describe communism as being an essentially egalitarian ideology?
Yeah, absolutely. But again, egalitarian of mind. I think it's less important, as long as everyone has enough to eat and like enough physical comfort and security to be able to think. I don't think it's all that important if Jeff Bezos has a yacht and I don't. I don't really need a yacht.
So, as you mentioned earlier, historically, a lot of communist regimes have been hostile towards Christianity in particular. Why do you think that is?
I think mostly because they're so similar. I mean, that it was often a criticism of Marxism that it claims to get away from Christianity, but really is just a secular version of it. So like usually when two things are different but very similar, they have to violently if they want to maintain a distinct identity, they have to violently prove that they are different than the other one.
So, would you say that you agree with the sentiment that Marxism is, or communism is a secular version of Christianity?
It depends what we mean by secular.
I would say secular simply means not concerned with religion or religious affairs in your personal life.
Do you mean how I define communism or how it's historically seen itself?
Well, I would say probably historically, because we're talking about the way that Christians were and have been treated under communist regimes.
Yeah, historically, I don't think it's a secular version of Christianity. I think it's maybe the inverse of Christianity, because often the way that hardcore communists and orthodox Marxists think about communism is a way of thinking, a way of doing politics and being in the world, which precisely doesn't think philosophically or metaphysically, doesn't think about any of these bigger questions, and is just purely about material things. So basically, the way that a lot of orthodox communists think of themselves is as doing everything that Christianity is not doing, or doing everything that Christianity has left out or is against. So it's sort of the inverse of Christianity in that way.
So, can you elaborate more on what you mean when you say communists historically have been interested in doing what Christianity isn't doing?
Yeah, so a lot of Christianity has said, oh, it doesn't matter what your material conditions are. It doesn't matter if you're suffering horribly, you're sick, you're oppressed, if you are prevented from enjoying yourself, because in the next life you will have your reward. Communists basically say the only thing that matters is that you're not suffering in this life, that you're enjoying yourself in this life, that you are free from oppression in this life. So while Christianity tends to completely negate and ignore earthly quotidian life, communism tries to only focus on earthly quotidian life and ignore the big metaphysical questions.
Could you talk briefly about communism's origins?
Yeah, so most communists today go back, of course, to Karl Marx, who only ever defined communism as the movement that does away with the present order of things. So it's completely a negative definition in the sense that communism is just what does away with what currently exists.
And that is the definition as Marx wrote?
That's correct.
Okay.
Marx was often criticized for not giving a positive definition of what a communist society would look like. And so lots of people since then have interpreted this in a lot of different ways. For some people, communism, they just stick to what Marx said, which can be interpreted in many ways. Like that could just mean thinking. If thinking rationally is negating immediate experience in order to produce abstract concepts, then thinking could be understood as communism, because that's doing away with what is presently materially at hand. Other people think of it as like a sort of anarchist thing, that just whatever exists, we have to be against. Whatever sort of state of society exists, we have to be against, and communism is pure motion, just to be constantly changing.
So, based on what you've just told me, would you say that communism is a coherent ideology?
No, communism is not a coherent ideology at all, but I would say most of the time people don't even think of it as an ideology. Marxism would be the ideology. Communism would be more the action that stems from Marxism.
So, would you describe Marxism as being a coherent ideology?
More or less, yeah. Marxists would often say there are many competing tendencies within Marxism that are often very opposed to each other. But in general, I think they share most of the important features.
What are your thoughts on the current state of communism in the world?
If you had asked me 2 months ago, I would have said it's doing okay. The last 2 months have not been so good. There was a coup in Venezuela, but a more capitalist friendly leader in charge. Already that was causing Cuba's economy to be close to collapse. Now with the Iran crisis, China is potentially at a disadvantage, and Cuba has been facing massive power outages over the last several weeks. So I don't think it's great, but I think China is in a position now in relation to the world that even the Soviet Union wasn't in at the height of its power. I think China has managed to figure out a lot of the problems that the Soviet Union faced. I don't expect China to decline anytime soon.
Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, we've mostly talked about communism, not about God. I think God is more important.
Why?
Because when we're talking about God, we're talking about ultimate realities, ultimate nature of reality. What it is even to exist, or to have a mind, or to have a body, or for matter to exist. And I think, you can't really deal rationally with any other question until you've thoroughly worked out what ultimate reality is.
So, as a final question, what role do you think, or how do you think God and theology, you personally, how do you think God and theology should be woven into communist ideology, if at all?
I think God should always come first. I think Marxism is a very interesting ideology, but it's very haphazard. I think it's not something you can really take and just apply to any situation. Basically, It's arisen from lots of different people with similar ideas in difficult situations trying to write down brief statements on what they think they're doing or what they've learned from their experience. So I think it's very spontaneous and haphazard and basically has to be reinvented every time anyone wants to actually rationally do something communistic. And so like when you're looking for some stability, some like stable text or idea to turn to, I think you should turn to God, not to Marx.
That was Isaac Hecht, a current instructor at the University of Utah. So I asked one of the students flatly, is it possible for capitalist and communist to peacefully coexist?
I think it is like tolerancing a machine where there is technically a perfect area. If that can be manufactured by humans, I don't fully know.
Capitalist and communist certainly disagree on many things, so perhaps conflict between the two of them is inevitable. Perhaps it is naive to think that anything other than open warfare is a possibility. But my position is that being communist is not a reason to be attacked, killed, enslaved, or forced into accepting an alternative political system. If America is the land of the free, should we just kill those who disagree with us and rob them of the freedom to choose alternative ways of governance? Is being politically distinct a crime worthy of violent retribution? My answer is a definitive no. Thank you for listening to the first episode of the Red Alert podcast. Please join us next week when we will be discussing the metaphysics of fascist confectionery techniques. Thank you. And remember that God loves you.
We shoot the sick, the young, the lame. We do our best to kill and maim. Because the kills all count the same, napalm sticks to kids. Flying low across the trees, pilots doing what they please, dropping flags on refugees. Napalm sticks to kids. Flying low and looking mean, see that family by the stream. Drop some nape and hear them scream.